It's been almost a month since the Trump assassination attempt, and yet we still don't know why the shooter was able to get within range of the 45th president. Steve Baker, an investigative journalist for Blaze Media, is here to tell you what the FBI won't. So, Steve, you posted a photo of an undercover officer at Donald Trump's rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, and wrote on X, "Can there be any doubt as to why there was a Secret Service counter-sniper team deconfliction problem?" Read, delay in taking the shot when you have a plainclothes officer on duty dressed almost identical to crooks. So can you explain some of the significance of what you found?
Well, we actually have found other, maybe we would call them counter-surveillance operatives in the crowd. We don't know which agency they're working for. We'll get to that in a moment.
Yep.
But they're dressed similarly to Thomas Crooks, or was Thomas Crooks dressed similarly to them? That's the question. Because once he was on that roof, and by the way, he was on that roof for about 3.5 minutes by our estimation, fully erect, walking tall across that roof.
Yeah.
And if they knew that they had counter-surveillance individuals in the crowd looking like him, those sniper teams had to deconflict.
And we have a series of images. I would love for you to walk us through some of these. As you're saying, he was able to stand upright, and walk across the roof.
He was able to stand up and walk across the roof for a couple of reasons. Number one, he looked like people they had as operatives in the crowd. The second reason is, if you can look at that circle right there at the very bottom, it's a long distance range. This was an actual officer's body cam from the Butler police. And what he saw, I don't know that he could see it with his own eyes, but what he captured on his body cam was the actual beginning of Thomas Crooks walking erect across that roof.
That's him in that
correct.
circle,
That's
standing
correct.
up, walking across.
That is him right there. And that we know that because we have spent,
because you've looked at all the angles.
We spent the entire weekend looking at these, zooming in up close, watching it from all the angles. So we know that this is him. And of course, the Secret Service sniper teams that were on those two barns behind the stage, they had another problem. They had a tree blocking and obscuring their view. Even if they could see by the angles there, and you can see from this photo here, that tree that is circled, even if they could see him, they weren't sure, because counter-sniper teams always operate in pairs, and they were concerned about whether his spotter may have been behind that tree. They didn't know whether they could take a shot or not and not be taking out one of their own.
Can you tell just how similar the attire is that we're talking about here?
It's almost identical. We're talking about white to almost white, cargo pants, knee length, and a rock and roll dark gray shirt.
Seems like not a coincidence, in other words.
Look, you have to go to coincidence. You have to go to incompetency before you go to malfeasance or conspiracies or anything else like that. But it's just layer upon layer upon layer.
But when you looked at that photo and you had tweeted it out earlier, you had noticed something that was a little different when you tried to figure out what agency this undercover plainclothes officer was a part of, and you had trouble figuring it out.
From the body cam that captured this undercover or plainclothes officer, what we saw was a badge that was hanging from his collar. And so I then found the most clear shot I could find of that badge, and then we zoomed in, and then we discovered from that zoomed angle that the badge had been completely obscured. It had been rubbed out, not physically, but with using Photoshop or some more video editing software. But they also distorted the shape of the badge, so because badges have different departments, different agencies have very distinctive shapes. So even if they had wiped off FBI or Secret Service or Washington County, township or whatever, if they had wiped that off, we could still identify the badge by the shape, but they actually went in and blackened out the edges of it so that we could not even identify the shape of the badge.
Yeah, the suspicious elements here to this story keep piling up, but we're still continuing to unearth new footage. New stuff is coming in, new information. I'm sure you've seen more. Give us a little taste of what's around the bend.
It's the same thing that we dealt with in January 6th. We had limited data in the early weeks, and then we had more and more as the months and the years wore on, and we're learning more about that. We're going to continue to learn more about this, but ultimately, there's a lot of things that have been edited out of this footage that Judicial Watch found. They got that through their FOIA request, and that's what we've been working from, myself and Joe Hanneman here with Blaze Media. So we've been working through that for several days now, and we're not only identifying the anomalies like this, but we're finding more and more of these selective edits in the video and in the audio.
Now, you and Joseph Hanneman already have a piece out on January 6th. You have an entire series basically on January 6th, but the latest one on Blaze.com was the DNC pipe bomb planted while Kamala Harris was inside on January 6th. So what can you tell us about the latest here?
The most important thing that we have to understand about this particular incident, well, the two most important things. The first thing is that if the FBI would just release the entire quantity of the DNC security cameras. And I'm not talking about the Capitol CCTV cameras. We've already done multiple stories of how those were moved away and turned deliberately from the command center away from the investigative scene. But the DNC cameras that caught the alleged bomber on the evening of the 5th, a little after 7 o'clock, all they have to do is just give us 24 hours unrestricted access to that. We'll know when the bomb was placed. We'll know who placed it, because we never saw that guy actually place the bomb beside the bench. We believe that we may have found evidence that it was placed just 15 minutes before it was discovered, while then VP-elect Kamala Harris was inside that building.
You're finding images of badges being digitally effaced.
Yes.
Do you really think that if that videotape exists, that the FBI has, that they're going to cough it up? Or are they going to say, oh, we lost the tapes, they got destroyed, sorry about that?
Well, we know what they're going to say to begin with. They're going to say this is part of an ongoing investigation, and they're not going to give that to us. But the bottom line is, if they don't give it to us, they deserve all the conspiracy theories. They deserve all the ridicule that they can take. They deserve the derision from Congress members that bring them forward, and of course the sternly worded letters that for what good those do. But the bottom line is they could solve the whole thing. There's nothing about that DNC video, by the way, that meets the standard of classified, highly sensitive, top secret in any way, shape, or form. All they have to do is release that, and then we see what the blind spot obscures from the Capitol CCTV across the street. We see exactly who and when placed that bomb.
So you said VP-elect Kamala Harris was in that building at the time, yet we heard AOC crying and saying, oh, my life was in danger, I could have died. Yet Kamala Harris, I don't recall her really making a big issue, that day, saying I was so close to this.
As of this date in August 2024, 3.5 years later, more than 3.5 years later, Kamala Harris has not uttered one single word or taken a single question from a complicit press about her presence inside that building that day. There's a reason for that.
What do you think she would say or will say when eventually that question is asked? I mean, with Elon Musk moving X in a direction that seems to be increasingly supportive of Donald Trump, or at least increasingly critical of the administration, it seems like only a matter of time before people start asking this very question.
Somebody's eventually going to ask her the question. Certainly somebody like me is never going to get access to Kamala Harris. Not likely anyway.
You're on too many lists.
I am already. And we are anticipating that when she is asked that question, because the DNC for the Democrats, as well as the RNC headquarters for the Republicans, are used for where they make their fundraising calls, because they can't make them from their offices legally otherwise. So they go to these buildings to do that. So we're going to hear that that's what she was doing. But this is the key. Her coronation was taking place inside the Capitol building in the House chamber at 1 o'clock on January 6th was when the session was called and the debate began and a vote was going to take place. But we know from this latest OIG investigative report that was released last week that she was scheduled to be in that building from 11:30 a.m. till 3:30 p.m. She was scheduled to miss the literal event that was going to make her the second most important person in the country.
Before we let you go, Steve, Donald Trump is set to sue the Justice Department for $100 million in damages over the FBI's raid on Mar-a-Lago back in 2022. We keep talking about events that shouldn't have happened or did happen, just the government overreach everywhere. So what's your take on Donald now coming out and trying to get $100 million here?
Well, he probably needs the $100 million considering what they've leached from him over the last several years in legal fees. But this is another example of, look, if the United States government was operating within the limits of the law itself, within the limits of the Constitution itself, even as recent Supreme Court rulings have elucidated for us, we would know that that event would not have taken place, shouldn't have taken place. And even though it wasn't a shootout at the Mar-a-Lago Corral that day between the FBI and the United States Secret Service, it's an event that shouldn't happen. And you know what? He deserves as much compensation as anybody else who's been put through this by our federal government.
Steve Baker, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
When we come back, Chris Bedford dares to ask the question, what's going on in the Trump campaign? Just ahead.